Good afternoon, folks. We welcome you all to this latest monthly webinar by the MIT Alumni Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Network. We are a group of groups. We like to connect alumni. We like to talk about what alumni are doing out beyond the MIT campus. And we find that by working together, we really can do we are doing a lot of amazing things with people who aren't MIT alums. But when we get together in groups of MIT alums, we also can do some very special work and help to solve some of the big problems and challenges we have in trying to preserve our environment and get our energy system transformed. Today's webinar, the actual logistics of it are that the chat is not enabled for you. The chat, however, may have some things like URLs and links to the reports we're going to be talking about today. So the panelists can talk to the audience through the chat, but you cannot talk to us through the chat. You may use, and please use, the question and answer function of Zoom. We will be picking most of our questions after the speakers from the question and answers. So today our issue is reaching net zero, pathways and roadmaps for getting there. We have picked out two. One was in national media recently, the Net Zero America work done by Princeton's, I guess Jesse's going to tell us about the name of the actual center when he presents. Jesse graduated MIT and with his PhD in 2018. And we also have the roadmap that I'm more familiar with because I live in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap. And for that, we have Aurora Edington, who is on the team at the consulting firm Cadmus. And Aurora, I don't have your year of graduation right here at my fingertips. I want to say 15, but you'll tell us that. Both roadmaps used system design principles in the modeling to reflect the complexity of the systems and to evaluate possibilities of what could happen in the next 30 years. Yes, 2050 is only 30 years away. Princeton looked at 5 scenarios in line with the IPCC modeling, and Cadmus and the MASS roadmap looked at 8 scenarios. In both cases, the roadmaps, they were evaluated for some nearer term milestones. I think the term backcasting was certainly used in Massachusetts, and this would help us direct nearer term kinds of policies that would set us on the path to 2050 with no net greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere and hopefully more coming out of the atmosphere. Special feature of the Princeton work is that the integrated results were evaluated for each of the 50 states. So it makes it somewhat unique. And with that, I'm going to pass this along to Raymond Bueno, who will introduce the speakers.
Good afternoon, and I'm glad all of you are here. I want to briefly read about Aurora and Jesse and then hand them off to them, okay? So Aurora Edington is a senior analyst at the Cadmus Group, as was mentioned. As a senior analyst at the Sustainability and Energy team, she supports primarily state and local public clients with established strategies and programs encouraging the development of renewable energy and meeting the climate goals. Her work there at Cadmus has included things like managing projects like the Massachusetts Decarbonization Study and leading the modeling of decarbonization plans for the city of Kingston, New York, and Westchester Council of Governments in Pennsylvania. Prior to Cadmus, she earned a master's degree from the Technology and Policy program at MIT and spent 2 years at the Department of Energy. And prior to that, all that, she graduated from Yale with a bachelor's in environmental engineering. Then Jesse Jenkins will speak after that. He's an assistant professor at Princeton University. It's a joint appointment between the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the, I could always get it, Englingler Center for Energy and the Environment. He is a macro-scale energy systems engineer focusing on the rapidly evolving electricity sector, including transitions to zero carbon resources and the proliferation of distributed energy resources and the role of electricity in decarbonization economy-wide. He leads the Princeton Zero Carbon Energy Systems Research and Optimization Lab, the Zero Lab, that focuses on improving and applying optimization-based energy systems models to evaluate low carbon energy technologies and generate insights guiding policy and planning decisions in national and subnational jurisdictions, transitioning to net zero emissions energy systems. He earned a PhD and a master's from MIT, and he worked previously as a postdoc fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he spent 6 years as an energy and climate policy analyst prior to embarking on the academic career. So with that, I will pass it on to Aurora. Welcome.
Thank you, Ramon. Here, I'm going to share my screen here. Let's share this. Can you see it? Just want to make sure we're all
Yes.
Excellent. Great. So I am really excited here to be with you all today. Thanks for that great introduction, Ramon. And I feel very lucky. I had the opportunity while I was at Cadmus to support the Commonwealth in the research and writing of the Massachusetts decarbonization study. So, in terms of my actual role, I was a co-author with a team of the roadmap itself, and I helped coordinate the technical report writing that contributed to it. And this was along with working with the core project team to manage the process and the project. And a quick disclaimer here, you can see it on the screen, but all of the views I'm talking about here and expressed today are my own. They don't necessarily represent the views or opinions of the Commonwealth or EEA. So, with that out of the way, happy to be speaking, and I'll get right into it. Very high level agenda. I'll give a quick overview of some Massachusetts context, dive into the analytical approach and what went into the study, and then I'll conclude with some key findings. So the big picture overview, what is the study? Overall, the study was a 2-year research effort conducted with a team under the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, EEA for short. And in terms of goals, it sought to develop a comprehensive understanding of the 30-year transition to reach net zero in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Particularly, one of these goals was not just to, project out to 2050, but to use this long-term understanding to develop near-term insights for decision-making for the Commonwealth in the short term. All of the, reports and findings are published, publicly available online. You can find them at the link here. I think it'll be also posted in the Zoom chat. And it's all fairly recent, published at the very end of 2020 in December. So a quick note here on context. I know there's a lot on this slide in terms of the timeline. I don't intend you to read it all. But this timeline is included in the roadmap, and it highlights some of the key climate change actions that occurred. And I'm just going to highlight really three of these actions. The very start of the timeline here, back in 2008, just want to highlight the Global Warming Solutions Act, which was signed into law at that time. And it was important for setting up a statewide greenhouse gas emissions inventory, establishing reduction limits for each decade, and requiring an implementation plan to achieve limits every 10 years. And this implementation plan is what we call the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. Just last year, Governor Baker committed Massachusetts to net zero emissions by 2050. EEA Secretary Hugh Herides established the net zero greenhouse gas statewide emissions limit as well. As we all of us, if we're still in Massachusetts, may be aware of, in 2021, Senate Bill 9 was passed in Massachusetts, the climate bill. And so, I want to call this out. This happened after the roadmap, but it was a really important next step towards climate action in the Commonwealth. It codified net zero and made it the legal limit by 2050. It increased protections for environmental justice communities in the Commonwealth. And it did a lot of other really great stuff in terms of climate, authorizing the implementation of new voluntary energy efficient building codes and, allowing procurement of more offshore wind, all very important things, but certainly an important part of the context here. And then the last part of this background section, I really need to make sure to say I was part of a broad team on both the Commonwealth stakeholder side and then, of course, the supporting consultant research side. I sit here with, here I can use my mouse here. I sit here with Cadmus. So, we were managing this research team over on the right, which essentially consisted of a lot of experts in their fields. And we really pulled together this team to provide top-notch analysis for the Commonwealth in this effort. Then, of course, on the left-hand side, there were a large variety of stakeholders involved that EEA helped manage and coordinate their input. We had, the IAC, Implementation Advisory Committee, Academic Steering Committee. Their state agencies were engaged throughout in the governor's office. And of course, there were community meetings throughout and input gathered from community members. So it's a broad team, a lot of folks thinking about this important issue. And so with that, I'll jump right in here. The analytical approach, starting big picture, what you're seeing here is a figure representing where the Commonwealth has been historically in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That's where you see essentially this kind of jagged line of real emissions based on the inventory. And then where it smooths out, you see where emissions need to go to meet net zero. It's a useful figure to start with. I like to use it for context setting because it's helping to recenter the key issue at hand. So, how do we get to that 2050 goal, right? Obviously, in this figure, you can see that there are various sector emissions that are broken out, and that's an important start. The decarbonization study, an important part, was indeed doing sector-specific analysis. And in this visualization of the process, you see essentially the cover pages of each of the reports. You see there are 6 technical reports that summarized and laid out the research and analysis that in turn, fed into the decarbonization roadmap here, centered in the center here with its cover page. And ultimately, as I mentioned on my second slide, I think the real goal as well is not just to set that long-term vision, but then to, bring it back to the near term and set those shorter term policy priorities in the clean energy and climate plan. So, this is the high level overview of process and analysis, but it's important to understand fossil fuels are powering nearly every aspect of our economy and daily lives. So, it became apparent that a systems thinking approach was going to be a pretty important component of this work. And to understanding the complexity and interconnections that are kind of implicated when you're doing deep decarbonization analysis and thinking. And, I'm going to talk now about that with particularly the Energy Pathways report, Energy Pathways to Deep Decarbonization here. And so let me jump into that. So systems engineering at a high level is based on the idea that you can't easily separate parts from the whole in complex systems without losing important interactive effects to essentially the overall result. So sector-specific modeling is valuable because you can look at specific sectors, you can break it down into its subsectors and start to really think about, what levers you can pull at that level. But at the same time, without a big picture kind of economy-wide approach, there's a potential that greenhouse gas emission reduction success in one sector is actually at the expense of another sector potentially, and could be unsustainable system-wide. So essentially what we did was set up a process where we had both an economy-wide system modeling, we had, that's kind of illustrated in green here, along with sector-specific modeling that's in the blue box here. And essentially what this did was set up a really nice framework for looking at the full economy through the Energy Pathways report. And that essentially looked at, the northeastern region of the US to look at, how energy was being traded between states, what kind of impacts we might see. The northeastern region includes the New England states plus New York and Quebec and New Brunswick. And this model is essentially balancing hourly and annual energy supply and demand under a carbon constraint while optimizing or minimizing for total costs. And then on the other side, the sector-specific modeling is looking at, the specific specific sectors and subsectors and really trying to drill down. So, going a bit more further into that economy-wide modeling, we used a series of 8 pathways to essentially investigate, what the no regrets actions might be. I say this because I think it's a really important point. Future modeling is not about like getting the exact future we're going to see in 2050. I think, modelers understand that it's impossible to predict the future. We know we're not going to get it exactly right. So one really beneficial part of pathways analysis is that you can essentially run a bunch of different scenarios that are toggling different components of the system. And then you can look across them and start to see, well, what's the same across all of them? What do we know is a, no regrets action in the short term or the long term in terms of getting to that net zero future? And so that's one of, the strong benefits of this type of pathways analysis. Here in this table, I'm not going to go through every word here. I'm sure you might have been skimming it, or you certainly were skimming it while I was speaking. But, at the heart of it, 8 pathways, you have an all options pathway that's essentially using kind of the midpoint assumptions across the various technical parameters in the model. And then you have a variety of pathways. On one hand, the DER breakthrough is, asking, okay, let's pretend there's a ton of behind the meter solar deployed. What are the effects of that? Or if we jump to the bottom, what if, we can't actually install as much offshore wind as we would like to, or, efficiency gains aren't as successful as we might hope, right? And so these are just some representation or an example of a couple of the pathways here that we studied. Ton more detail on each of them in the Energy Pathways report and the roadmap report, as a matter of fact, but this is essentially what drove a lot of the analysis. So let me jump into some key findings here. At a high level, the highest takeaway level, we found some pillars of decarbonization for the Commonwealth that it could generally focus its efforts around in order to reach net zero. These are illustrated on the slide here in this figure. You can see essentially it's including transitioning kind of end uses away from consuming fossil fuels, includes trying to maximize energy efficiency and electric load flexibility to try and be as cost effective as possible on your decarbonization journey. It includes producing zero and low carbon energy supplies, and it also includes carbon dioxide removal, carbon sequestration as a key component to the picture. Now I'm going to, over the next couple slides, talk through the sectors and those big takeaways in terms of no regrets actions for the Commonwealth. So starting here with the buildings and transportation sector, you might generally group these into kind of like end uses and trying to change those. So in the building sector, one of the key strategies is the electrification of space and water heating. It's been found to be a low risk and very cost-effective strategy for decarbonizing a lot of building stock in the state. Heat pumps are a primary technology here that have been proven, and they're here today, and we know they work. Another aspect here is, again, improving efficiency, as I said with that second pillar on the last slide. If you decrease the amount of energy you need, you're just going to save costs both individually as a consumer, but also for the entire system. And then there is anticipated to be a potential role for decarbonized fuel use, right? And so this is kind of something that isn't quite set in stone today if you looked at our infrastructure technology, but it could be something down the line. In the transportation sector, we're essentially looking at trying to reduce emissions from light duty transportation to nearly zero. This is largely facilitated through switching from fossil fuel vehicles to zero emission vehicles, which could include EVs, electric vehicles, or hydrogen powered vehicles. And then this third point, it's really important to maintain and support the existing kind of vehicle miles traveled reduction measures. So that includes things like continuing to support and invest in public transit, reducing single occupancy vehicle as much as possible, And of course, supporting like mobile infrastructure like bike lanes and sidewalks. If we move to the next two sectors here, energy supply, really important sector, especially as you electrify end uses. What it means is you're relying more on electricity. So this first point, or I guess I'll start with the second point, the installed capacity is going to more than double, right? As we're electrifying, trying to clean our energy use, relying on electricity is a really key strategy. And the second component of that, now the first bullet point here on the slide, is that offshore wind and solar PV end up making up the most of electricity generation. And then, of course, when you have systems, decarbonized systems with a lot of variable resources like wind and solar, it's important to make sure, we're setting up that system to be balancing resources and technologies to help operate the grid and account for those fluctuations in power. Kind of an interesting finding on this point too is that actually electric technologies are a lot more efficient than their kind of fossil fuel counterparts. So there's a really interesting trend, certainly in Massachusetts, where you actually end up using less energy overall, but it's certainly a lot more electricity. So I think that's a pretty interesting and key finding, is just electrifying itself is more efficient. Skipping down here to the non-energy sector, you might be wondering, what is that? It includes a mix of things, including F-gases, fluorinated greenhouse gases. Those are used in like refrigeration, solid waste management, wastewater treatment, natural gas transmission and distribution or gas leaks, and agricultural soils and livestock. So that's kind of what's in the non-energy sector. And while a relatively small source of emissions overall, they are anticipated to be a significant portion of residual emissions in 2050. They're the most challenging to decarbonize, largely because these emissions are linked either to economic activity or the population. And so, this is a sector that's harder, but we know it's harder, right? So we can either work towards solutions that we may not have today, or at least know that this will be hard to decarbonize, and keep that in mind as we move towards 2050. The last sector here includes, land or land use. This is certainly linked to the carbon sequestration pillar. In essence, it's really important to continue managing the forests and natural resources, natural and working lands in the Commonwealth to enhance carbon sequestration that they are performing, but also helping to build ecosystem health and resiliency. So I'm going to close here with a couple thoughts I have of just particularly interesting areas to me. It's a very broad study, certainly with a lot of really exciting areas, but these two areas here, stock turnover and land use and siting, I think are great examples of maybe cross-cutting sector issues. So stock turnover is essentially referring to the point that for different technologies, there are different lifetimes that you have to consider, particularly when looking at the net zero future. In this, there are kind of two groups to think about, shorter lifespan technologies and longer lifespan infrastructure or equipment. On the shorter side, you can essentially look at these top 4 rows in the figure. And those are essentially, think of cars and thermal heating systems. There are millions of these for the Commonwealth. And so there are, distinct challenges when thinking about how to transition away from fossil fuel end uses. On the longer end, those last couple rows, you're looking at long-lived infrastructure. So that includes like pipelines or building envelopes, for example. They may or may not be replaced between now and 2050, depending on what you're talking about. But, across all of these, it's least cost to replace them or make them the most efficient at the end of life or when you're first building something. So it's really important to set up those frameworks and structures to set the state up for success. Moving on to the second point, land use and siting is a really important area just because there's several strategies that require using or conserving land. So think about, solar PV. Depending on, let's assume you want to have a ton of solar PV and you're looking at ground mounted solar. That's, directly trying to increase renewable electricity, but also puts into conflict potentially land use, right? And the land use it can be used for a lot of different things. I think one element I want to highlight is historically, there's a human element to land use that's important to acknowledge, since historic siting efforts have not been equitable in the past. They have been a source of environmental injustices historically. Good news is the recent climate bill helps move in the right direction in this area, and the law essentially is updating how the state calculates environmental impacts and essentially gives more credence to cumulative impacts on how pollution from a proposed project might add to already existing pollution. And so I think this is a really good step in the right direction, at least in respect to this important area. So I'm at the end of my slides here. I really enjoyed working on this project, getting to think about, high-level decarbonization in the Commonwealth and really tying it back to some really strong and thorough technical analysis. And it was a great team to work with throughout the project. So I'm thankful to it for having the experience, and thank you all for listening. And after Jesse speaks, I'll be happy to take questions along with him. But I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to turn it over to Jesse Jenkins to tell us about Net Zero America.
I'll just say briefly, thank you, Aurora, that to our audience, if it's numbers you're interested in, you're in luck, because there's plenty behind these reports. So I encourage you to take a look. You'll find plenty. With that, I hand it over to Jesse.
Thanks, and thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with Aurora. We overlapped in our time at MIT, and it's great to see what she's been up to, helping the Commonwealth figure out its path to net zero. Much the same time that Aurora was working on the Massachusetts Roadmap study, which I was actually on the technical advisory board for as well, and so got to see its process take shape along the way. I was working here at Princeton with a large team on the Net Zero America study, which tried to look at very similar options to transform the U.S. economy as a whole to this goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, that's the critical point where human-caused greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere each year are no greater than what we're drawing out of the atmosphere via our human activities and safely storing or sequestering in some sort of permanent form. That's not the end of the challenge, of course. Climate change will continue beyond that point, but it's a critical milestone in addressing the threats of dangerous climate change, and the point where the United States would at least stop contributing to the problem, since cumulative stocks of CO2 are what drive climate change, not the annual emissions levels. So we've got to stop pouring CO2 into the atmosphere each year. So this was a huge 2-year study, just like the Cadmus and Commonwealth project, involving a lot of different people with a lot of different skill sets in order to try to tackle such a diverse and complicated challenge as decarbonizing the whole country. And our goal was to try to inform public policymakers and private sector decision makers, particularly those thinking about investments in those durable assets that Aurora was just talking about, on what it actually takes to make aggressive progress on decarbonization. We've seen a wide range of commitments made by over the last couple of years by Fortune 500 companies, by a growing number of states, and by now the Biden administration and the White House, to this goal of net zero emissions, generally around a mid-century type timeframe. And so the question was, what does it actually take to get there? What do we have to build, when and where across the country? What pathways can we take if we have different choices or forks along the way, forks in the road along the way? What do all these options imply for how we make and use energy, and how that energy is supplied, and how that energy system affects us, including implications for things that we all care about, like jobs and human health, and of course, what this will all cost. And I think what made our study relatively unique in this space is the distinctive degree of high geographic and temporal granularity, which try to take the high-level modeling results from the macro-scale energy system model which we used, which was also used in support of the Massachusetts roadmap, and take those results and what we call downscale them, or take them down to a more human and visceral scale at a local, county, or state level, so we can try to understand what these trends mean across the country and in our backyards. And that state level granularity helps us also think about the distribution of costs and benefits across the country, which are ultimately going to be pivotal in what decisions we make about our transition to net zero emissions. In addition, much like the backcasting that we were just talking about, by looking out to 2050, we can also take a step back to today and try to understand what blueprint for immediate action we might need to put in place, and what specific policy priorities and actions in terms of investments that need to be made over the next 10 years in order to get ourselves on track and make sure that we are able to make progress towards this net zero goal. And I should say you can find the full report at this netzeromerica.princeton.edu link here, including all of the quantitative results from this study at a state level, scenario by scenario and year by year. So we looked in the study at 5 overall pathways to net zero emissions by 2050. We modeled about 60 sensitivity scenarios as well, but these are the 5 main pathways that we focus on. And you can see here our total primary energy supply, or the inputs of energy sources into our economy today, with its overwhelming reliance on fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil. And in a frozen policy or no new policy scenario here out to 2050, you can see that there's very little change in the overall makeup of our primary energy supply. Really quite a bit of oil and gas still, slight declines in coal and nuclear power, and increases in wind and solar, but not a dramatic change from where we are today. In contrast, these 5 pathways are different ways in which we might make the transition to net zero emissions. All of them meet the same demands for final energy services as in our frozen policy scenario. So we're not assuming dramatic changes in lifestyles or significant reductions in vehicle miles traveled or conversions of our diet. All those things could help also make progress on climate change, but this is sort of a business as usual type growth in demand for energy services. And we're looking at how do we find the least cost mix of resources that could meet that demand under a few different sets of constraints. So these 5 scenarios basically span 3 different key levers or choices that we have as we think about how to get to net zero. And that first lever is the degree of end-use electrification. So how much are we going to rely on electric vehicles or building electrification of building heating and water heating with heat pumps or other activities that help shift our energy consumption onto electricity, which we can then provide with clean sources. So the E+ scenario here, which is our first one, is a high electrification scenario where we construct a case with basically full saturation of markets for electric vehicles, and heat pumps by 2050, meaning on-road vehicles, are about 98% electric by 2050, and similar high shares of building and water heating also provided by electric heat pumps. In the E- case, we model a more modest or less high electrification case, with still a much greater reliance than today on electric vehicles and heat pumps, but a less than full saturation. So that by 2050, in the E- scenario, about 50 to 60% of vehicle miles traveled and space heating and cooling and water heating in our buildings is electric by 2050. Other than that, those 2 scenarios are relatively unconstrained, with the exception of the limitation on the role of bioenergy, which is the green part of the pie here. In 4 of our 5 scenarios, we limit the available supply of biomass to ensure no large conversions of land that's currently dedicated to agricultural or forestry production into bioenergy feedstock production. And that's intended to try to be conservative in limiting the land use implications, the impacts on food prices or sustainability or conservation goals if we were to convert a large amount of new land into bioenergy use. So that means we can use the land that currently is devoted to growing corn for ethanol production, which is already part of our bioenergy economy. It is about 40% of our corn crop. And we can use the sustainably harvested residues from agricultural and forestry activities. Because in the E- scenario, we have less electrification of vehicles and buildings, we have a greater demand then for liquid and gaseous fuels in this scenario. And that makes it a harder scenario to meet without expanding our supply of biomass, which is one of the few ways that we can make drop-in replacements of carbon neutral fuels, alternatives to transportation fuels or pipeline gas. And so in our E-B+ scenario, we relax the constraint on biomass and we assume the full billion-ton supply curve that estimated across the United States by the USDA and USDOE. And so you can see in that scenario, we have a lot more bioenergy. And then the last 2 scenarios are both variants of our high electrification scenario, and they basically limit and expand the role of wind and solar power, which play a key role in all of these pathways. As you can see, the blue and yellow chunks here play a substantial role in our primary energy supply, far larger than today, in all of these pathways. But in the RE- case, we limit the growth rate of wind and solar to reflect potential constraints on their deployment, like transmission expansion or siting limitations, so that we can deploy no more in this scenario than the maximum rate that we've seen historically, which is about 35 gigawatts in 2020. And so that constrains wind and solar to a much smaller share. And to pick up the slack, we see much bigger roles for nuclear power in orange and carbon capture, natural gas, much of it with carbon capture and storage in the gray here. Finally, the RE+ scenario is 100% primary energy from renewable resources, so mostly wind and solar with a significant contribution from biomass and smaller shares from hydropower and geothermal. So that scenario phases out fossil fuel use and nuclear use entirely by 2050, and as the only one to eliminate fossil fuel use entirely, which we have to force the model to do. All the other ones rely on some degree of negative emissions to continue using some amount of fossil fuels, dramatically less than today, but not zero, in order to allow us to use fossil energy in the hardest to abate or most costly to substitute for sectors, like jet fuel. So if you look at these 5 scenarios, you can see that they all use basically some combination of the same 4 key building blocks, which are our first 4 of 6 pillars of decarbonization highlighted in the report. In addition to the energy and industrial system, which is what I'm focused on here, we also discuss in the report the need to reduce non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions and enhance land carbon sinks, just as in the Massachusetts roadmap. But I'll focus here on these first 4, which include end-use energy efficiency and electrification. End-use efficiency to reduce the overall amount of energy use in the economy, to reduce the scale of infrastructure we have to build. And electrification, which delivers both energy efficiency because electric motors and heat pumps are more efficient than internal combustion engines and boilers at converting input energy to useful services. And they switch a substantial amount of our primary energy or final energy demands onto electricity, for which we have a large amount of cost-effective substitutes. So together, this is what helps drop our final demand for hydrocarbon fuels by about 2/3 in the high electrification scenarios, and our total primary energy demand, our final energy demand, by about 1/3. Even as the economy grows through 2050, I should say. So that's absolute declines in energy use, even though our economy is growing. Second is clean electricity. If we're going to dramatically expand the role of electricity to power vehicles and buildings and produce hydrogen and other uses, we need to more than double our supply of clean electricity, which grows by about 150% in most of our cases. And all of that then has to be clean generation, primarily wind and solar, but also other clean, firm power sources like nuclear power, natural gas or bioenergy with carbon capture or geothermal, and a substantial build out of transmission to support all of that. The third building block is bioenergy and other zero carbon fuels and feedstocks, which along with our fourth building block, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, helps us decarbonize point sources and substitute zero carbon fuels and feedstocks for fossil and derived fuels that we do not electrify. So all 4 of these we describe, or all 6 of these pieces we describe as pillars of decarbonization, because while we can push and pull on each of these and use them to differing degrees, removing any one of these pillars entirely results in the whole edifice falling down. So we find that it's either far more expensive or frankly infeasible to reach a net zero emissions goal without some combination of all 6 of these key building blocks. The good news is that we find that all of these transitions are affordable in the sense that none of them require spending more as a share of our GDP than we currently do or we have over recent periods of prosperity in American history. So if we look at the expenditures of on energy services as a share of our gross domestic product or economic activity, you can see the United States has spent between 5 and 8% of our GDP on energy services during prosperous periods of our history. Now, during global financial crises or oil price shocks, that can skyrocket to a much higher share of upwards of 10 to 14% at the worst. And in contrast, all of these pathways see us spending about 4% to at most 6% of our GDP on energy services throughout the whole transition, with very little cost difference between these pathways through 2040. And the higher cost scenarios here being the ones that rely much more significantly on synthetic fuels production, which ends up being one of the more costly ways to reach our decarbonization goals. Now, it's of course more expensive here than doing nothing, at least in terms of our direct expenditures on energy services. But this is assuming the same low oil and gas price trajectory in a do nothing scenario as in our net zero scenarios. And that's unlikely to be the case, right? If we're going to dramatically reduce oil and gas consumption, that's likely to lead to lower oil and gas prices, all else equal. And while we didn't have the capability to model that price response, so this reflects a conservative assumption of no price change, it's safe to say that the reference or frozen policy case would actually be more expensive than shown here and closer in line with our net zero transition paths. In addition, this is without counting any of the significant benefits of decarbonization, including trillions of dollars of reduced air pollution damages and avoided climate change damages in the future. So this is an affordable transition, but one that is, of course, transformational. So it's not to say that it should be easy. Cost is no longer a primary barrier, but we, in our work and our downscaling of each sector, identify 4 transformational changes on the path to net zero, which are worth focusing on. The first being the significant amount of capital that needs to be mobilized. The second, the transformation of our energy workforce. The third, huge amounts of new physical infrastructure that have to be built across the country in a new nation building moment for our country. And fourth, substantial improvements in air pollution and public health. So to take those each briefly in turn, on capital mobilization, while the transition to a net zero economy is affordable in terms of our annual expenditures, because we are shifting our energy infrastructure to a more capital-intensive set of investments, like wind and solar facilities or storage facilities that are all upfront cost and save us on operating costs over time, or efficient buildings or electric vehicles that cost more at the get-go, but again, reduce our consumption of fuel use and costs over the long term, we do need to see a substantial amount of capital invested in the near term. These are not costs, these are investments that are paid back over time through our annual energy expenditures on fuels and electricity, etc. But it does mean we need to be seeing the policy and financing conditions to mobilize very large amounts of capital over the next decade and beyond. In fact, if we compare the reference or frozen policy case to our net zero paths, we see that we need about $2.5 trillion of additional capital invested during the 2020s alone. You can see here the boxes show the relative scale of investment in each of the key areas of incremental investment. And so you can see these are basically the policy to-do list, which is these are the things that policy needs to be enacted to mobilize investment in each of these key categories. And that could be cross-cutting measures like carbon pricing or cap and trade programs, or they could be sectoral policies or tax incentives or direct federal expenditures. But something has to touch each and every one of these buckets or boxes in order to induce this amount of additional public and private sector investment to get on track to net zero by 2050. The next transformation is in our energy workforce, where we see at a high level a net increase in jobs and energy-related employment of about 500,000 to 1 million net jobs by 2030 and 2 to 3 million by 2050, but substantial transformations at the local level and across time. And so while we see net gains in most of the country, there's a large amount of dislocation in our energy workforce, particularly after 2030, as we see declines in oil and gas production. But in the near term, states like West Virginia and counties in Wyoming and Pennsylvania that are reliant on coal production will see this kind of transition unfold in the near term. And we have to proactively address these transformations to ensure that no one is left behind in this transition to net zero. And so the work that we've done, the downscaling efforts to try to identify the impacts on transitions across our workforce can help identify opportunities to reshape the economic opportunities in a net zero transition to ensure that everyone benefits and to mitigate the impacts on those communities that are currently dependent on fossil energy extraction. The third piece is our physical infrastructure. We need to be back in a nation building mode. It's been decades since we built out a large amount of infrastructure across this country. But if we're going to completely transform the way we make and use energy, there's no way to do that without transforming our physical infrastructure. This chart here shows a map of our current solar and wind capacity and high voltage transmission across the United States. And this is what that might look like in 2030 with 600 gigawatts of new wind and solar capacity added over the next decade and about a 60% expansion of our transmission system. By 2050, in a high electrification unconstrained scenario, we could end up with about 1.5 terawatts each of solar and wind capacity, or about an 8-fold expansion from current levels and a tripling of transmission. We would also need to build out a long-distance CO2 pipeline network to enable capture of CO2 from biomass, from cement facilities, and from power plants and other industrial sources all over the country, and safe transport and storage in geologic basins, mostly concentrated in the Gulf Coast, but at a few other locations you can see here in gray. Finally, there are substantial and positive improvements in air pollution and public health. Our clean electricity and electrifying vehicles would deliver huge improvements in these in public health impacts. This shows the current premature mortalities from coal-fired power plants across the country and from motor vehicle pollution, which are significant. If we're in a high electrification scenario, both of these are effectively eliminated by 2050, saving about 100,000 coal-related air pollution deaths and about 160,000 air pollution deaths related to electrification of transportation. That could be on the order of $2 to $3 trillion of economic damages avoided just from premature mortalities, without counting hospitalizations and asthma attacks and all the other impacts that would be avoided. So in closing, what our report reveals is an affordable but transformational change in our economy that requires us to manage a set of key trade-offs and choices. Most of these paths head along the same route over the next decade, but we need to prepare over that decade to make choices about where to head beyond that. None of these pathways is ideal along every single axis, and instead we face a number of implementation challenges that are different depending on the path we go down, and different positive and negative impacts across the economy depending on which path we choose. And so this kind of analysis can help us understand what those choices look like, to help us make those choices in a proactive manner, and to understand the trade-offs of if we say no to one route, we're going to have to find another route which may entail differing challenges and differing opportunities. So I'll leave it there and look forward to further discussion in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. That was great. I'd like to first ask a very specific kind of electricity question that came from William Booth, and there was another battery question here. Was storage modeled as standalone facilities and or combined with wind and solar facilities?
So in the Net Zero America study, I assume this is probably the same. This is the same model in the Massachusetts study. They're modeled at the moment as standalone facilities. So we're not using the same grid connections as the solar or wind facilities. And we do see, I see the next question, there's significant overbuilt solar capacity in the sense that you build a lot of it because it's cheap per kilowatt. And you do curtail it some of the time, or store that energy for use in later periods. That ends up being a pretty consistent feature in any least cost optimization model, that we have an increase in total installed capacity that's much greater than the increase in total energy use, because much of that capacity is intermittently available, like wind and solar and batteries, and therefore we need more overall. And that's cost effective because the cost per kilowatt of those technologies is so much lower, so we're paying less per kilowatt of capacity and saving on the energy side of things. I should say we're in my group, we're actually implementing in our Gen X electricity system planning model, which was originally developed at MIT and used in Aurora's thesis and my thesis and other work. We've just implemented a student, Anisha Minosha, as an undergraduate student actually at Princeton, has implemented a new version of the model that does co-locate storage along with wind and solar, as well as thinks about how to optimize the sizing of the grid connection and the solar and wind capacity, because often it makes sense to actually not build a transmission line that to export 100% of your output all the time, but rather to sort of overbuild your wind and solar and save on transmission. And so we'll be able to start optimizing those kinds of trade-offs in our future work.
Yeah, just to chime in, Jesse summarized it on storage. It does not include behind the meter storage, or it's not like built as a non-wires alternative in the model, if that might be what you're getting at there. I will say, yeah, curtailment. I mean, yeah, Jesse covered it well on kind of curtailment of renewables. There actually is a really interesting section you might want to check out in the Energy Pathways report on just kind of balancing resources and how different balancing resources can contribute to reducing renewables curtailment. But it is still, it's such a low cost electricity resource, solar is, to be clear, that in some cases it's more cost effective to curtail some solar. That's not the end goal we want, but in terms of the way these models optimize for least cost, sometimes that is part of that least cost solution. But of course, if there are conversion technologies to use that excess electricity to instead be producing hydrogen or something like that, which is one of the balancing resources that are discussed in certainly the Energy Pathways report, it's certainly, we want to use that first.
That's good. I also wanted to go into something a little further from your energy modeling, which is the co-benefits. You mentioned it, Jesse, that the trade-off of healthcare, of health impacts and costs, of course. One of the things that I really did find interesting about the Massachusetts effort is that there was a very big environmental justice lens. They were very, very focused on stakeholders and stakeholder input to make sure that the way it was being modeled and the way we would actually carry out policies would benefit everyone in the Commonwealth. So I wanted to just talk a little bit, see what you might say about the externalities and how they might be integrated into these models. I know that the Massachusetts roadmap had a specific report on health impacts. They found it a little difficult to try and use health models to integrate into the actual study done, but there is an appendix about that. And these externalities are going to start bending the profit and market growth trends that get modeled in these economic models to be either circular or even what's now known as a donut economy, where the goal is not necessarily money growth and lowest cost, but it's benefit to the society. So Jesse and Aurora, I don't know quite what you can add to that, but
If I could add to that, though, as part of the answer, if you could clarify, in your last slides, Jesse, you showed significant, very large potential savings in health benefits and so on. But in the models optimization, those costs are not part of the calculations? I just want to clarify.
Yeah, so we, as externalities, we don't model them as part of the cost optimization. We've externalized them in our society. We should not do that, but that's the way it is. So we see after the fact what the quote unquote co-benefits of our net zero transition look like for air pollution. I mean, I think in terms of environmental justice and just transition concerns, part of the reason we wanted to focus on this really granular analysis, geographically granular analysis, and I think part of the reason that Massachusetts and New York and Washington State and so many others that are tackling these challenges are so focused on these questions is that if we've sort of moved on from through a set of questions, right? Is this even technically possible? Right. And I think we answered that a few years ago with confidence, engineering models. Yes, we can design and build an energy system that meets our needs. And then the second question then becomes, well, is it going to be affordable, or is it going to be, is it going to break the bank and bankrupt us? And I think what we're seeing is that due to improvements in the cost of wind and solar and batteries and expected improvements in other technologies, if we're proactive in supporting them over the next decade, the answer is yes, it is affordable. It doesn't take a World War II style mobilization of 20% of our GDP and huge amounts of personal sacrifice to do this. Then the question that we're now grappling with is, okay, well, how do we go about it, and who wins and who loses? What are the benefits and distributions of costs and impacts across our economy? And to answer those questions, we need granular tools, right? We need tools that can provide a sense of what the distribution of benefits and impacts are, and to evaluate those across a much wider range of outcomes than just what's the least cost, engineering feasible strategy. So that's what we're trying to push forward with this study. And I think what it reveals is kind of three really big questions at minimum. There's probably many more than that, but at least three when you think about the kind of just transition implications. The first is we are going to see declines in incumbent industries, and the communities and counties and local economies that depend on those industries shouldn't be penalized for this transition and left out, right, as a normative goal, and also I think as a pragmatic one, in the sense that if we can mitigate those impacts, it's much more likely that we can sustain public policy support over the long time frame for these sorts of aggressive changes. So there's both a good pragmatic reason to do it, and of course a normative or ethical reason. And so this work can reveal where those transitions are going to be most significant and when they're likely to occur and how we might be able to mitigate them. The second piece is the big growth in new employment opportunities and new economic opportunities, right? And those should also be ideally broadly distributed across the economy, or at least in ways that build durable coalitions and don't raise concerns about inequity and unfairness, right? And where the benefits are being distributed across the country. So who has access to those jobs? Where are those investments being made? How does it benefit the local tax base? And where is that money spent? Those sorts of questions. And then the final piece is that there are communities that have been on the front lines of our fossil energy infrastructure and have borne the brunt of that impact for decades. And we cannot retrench those impacts in the transition to a net zero economy. So the reductions in the harms of our fossil energy system also need to be made real, and to benefit those who have, for too long been impacted by those impacts. And that's where the kinds of public health and air pollution outcomes that we look at can be significant. And again, we didn't optimize to maximize those benefits. We have done that. Aaron Mayfield is a postdoctoral researcher in our group who is focused on this question of how could we reconfigure the transition to actually maximize those benefits in the near term. So the same kinds of tools we use could be turned to different questions, not what's the lowest cost strategy, but what's an affordable strategy that maximizes these other kinds of outcomes. And I think really that's the frontier of the research and the task for all of us who do this kind of decision support modeling over the next few years.
Very good.
And, I didn't actually touch on economic or health impacts in my presentation. Would have been good to include a slide on that, but yes, Sarah's right. There is the economic and health impacts technical report. In the roadmap or in the decarbonization study, we ended up using IMPLAN and EPA's COBRA model for modeling kind of economic and health impacts. And I mean, the benefits, you can't argue with them. Certainly in terms of the health benefits, I liked Jesse's slide there where you saw a lot of health impacts. The next one, just absolutely none. But there was a degree of specificity, certainly in terms of air quality improvements. I think they found there were improved health outcomes for Barnstable, Norfolk, and Suffolk counties in Massachusetts, largely because there were more elderly at-risk or environmental justice populations in those counties. So that is, one instance of starting to look at this and starting to identify those communities. I mentioned in my presentation the S9 bill, which does provide that definition and protect a bit further environmental justice communities, which I think is important. But there's, turning to the economic side of this question, I think there's and jobs, I suppose, there's an interesting component where as we decarbonize the system, because there's less money spent on external imported fossil fuels, there's more money spent in state, which has beneficial effects just in terms of, back on the state level here, just for Massachusetts, there are benefits because of that increased in-state spending. And so that's another highlight I would kind of bring up at this point.
Yeah, and that's true at the national scale as well as a reduced exposure of our economy to fuel price volatility and global oil prices, right? I mean, if you look back at our GDP slide, right, it's anything but smooth. There are these huge spikes in the share of GDP that we've spent on energy, and that's been driven by our exposure to global oil price shocks. Right. And if we substantially reduce our reliance on oil and we have more substitutability between oil and other domestically produced fuels, that exposure is significantly reduced. So we showed like the nice smooth line for the reference scenario, but the reality is it's going to be a big jagged line depending on what those future volatility looks like, and that volatility should be much smaller if we reduce our oil and gas consumption substantially. So that's another significant economic benefit.
It's great. Unfortunately, we've come just about to the end of our seminar. There is a question here about comparing the U.S. models to the energy innovations ones, which I will send to our panelists after the webinar. Also, there's a very interesting question about how energy markets can be restructured to encourage new nuclear and other sources and batteries. And we also have the whole question of how does this relate to the way the Biden administration has put forward some ideas about how we're going to get to net zero. I want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. It has been great to have you here. It has been delightful to hear these background information on these roadmaps. I would like to just mention that EESN is definitely a groups of alums who are working together on some of these issues. We have a climate action group, which you can find on our website. Tomorrow evening, we're delighted to be able to announce that there's a webinar on societal change for a better world, and it's given by the Chinese alumni group. Peggy Liu founded the Joint U.S.-China Collaboration for Clean Energy perhaps 20 years ago, and she's still working on China Dream and how we can contain consumerism to make it sustainable, a sustainable world and a sustainable energy demand. In May, we seem to be coming up with Energy Month. If you want some of the technical energy questions, on the 12th, EESN is presenting energy storage at scale, high added value. So please check our website and our emails for that. And also on May 18th, the Club of Northern California is doing a session on commercial fusion, the potential for unlimited clean energy. So we really want to thank you all for coming today, and our two panelists. That was a great presentations. I think it was an interesting way to combine it. And thank you very much. And onward and upward, fight the good fight. Have a good afternoon, folks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.